You
Okay.
get a green light and you're good to go.
Great.
You can hold on to this, you can put it in a pocket, and there is a belt clip. I would recommend putting it in a pocket, though.
Okay.
It was that one was the Allegheny panels, including the ones that I was on, were pretty dull. So that one's a little bit better. I have to tell Laura since she does that.
So, hello everyone, and welcome. So, I'd like to welcome all the guests attending, all the students, and everybody joining us via live streams. So, I'm Kisle Prasad, Academic Director of the Center for Global Business, and this is the second of our events, the Distinguished Speaker Series. What we like to do is once every month bring distinguished panelists like will be introduced in a second to talk about issues related to international business, global trade, and a range of other topics dealing with international affairs. So today the topic for the day is, of course, the USMCA, and that is indeed a really hot topic around now. It's also a somewhat sensitive topic. We had invited representatives from the governments of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And in sequence, all of them got cold feet. But the politics of it at this moment in all these countries, I can understand, makes it a little complicated for them. Regardless, we have a fantastic panel here of experts, so you'll get a sense for how the USMCA is going to affect some of the most important sectors of the economy, the automotive sector, the dairy sector, and information technology as well. And broadly, you'll get a sense for how this treaty affects US business, but also all of us as consumers. So we have for us moderating the panel today, Doug Palmer, who's a veteran trade reporter. He was, I was looking at his bio, he was there at Seattle in 1999, which is a bit like being at Woodstock, I think, when it comes in the trade community. And he's covered every major trade deal since then. So I have a couple of announcements. First of all, there are going to be two mics, so please mic up, come to the mic afterwards. There'll be time for questions, and we do want you to participate. You can also tweet your questions for everybody who's watching the live stream at Smith Global Biz, and you can email Greg Rafal, grafal@rhsmith.umd.edu. Just one thing to remember, the conversation today is off the record, so if you're going to write about it or blog about it or tweet about it, don't attribute anything to any individual in particular. So don't identify any individual. Is that, I think that's what we agreed to. That would be okay, right? And then before I turn it over to our moderator, Doug Palmer, I want you to give a warm welcome to all of our panelists for taking time off to be here with us today. Thank you.
Well, hello. My name is Doug Palmer, and thanks for having us out here today. I'm the senior trade reporter at Politico, and I apologize. I'm not a great extemporaneous speaker, so I'm going to be reading from notes. I'm happy to be here with this group of trade experts and specialists to talk about the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is President Trump's new name for NAFTA. And before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce all of the panelists that we have here today, so you know who they are and what perspective they come from. To my right, we have Laura Bauman, who is president of the Trade Partnership. That's a data analysis firm that does a lot of number crunching on the economic impact of various trade actions. Down there at the far end, we have John Murphy, who is a senior vice president at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where he focuses on international economic affairs and trade issues. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the biggest U.S. business group, and it represents a variety of sectors. Then we have three panelists who track trade issues either for a particular industry or sector. Down here on this end, we have Alex Perkins, who is Senior Manager of International Government for the Fiat Chrysler Automobile Group. Right next to me is Beth Hughes, who is Senior Director for International Affairs at the International Dairy Foods Association. And finally, we have Sam Rizzo, who is Director of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council. So with those introductions out of the way, I thought I would just start by giving a brief recap of the events that have led us to where we are today with a possible vote in Congress on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. So just a little bit of history. The original NAFTA was negotiated in the early 1990s. Before that, there was actually a U.S.-Canada free trade agreement, and then Mexico asked to join. It was passed by Congress in '93, and after a contentious debate, was approved and went into force on January 1st, 1994. So NAFTA will turn 26 in just a few months, which is just a few years older than many people attending this college. This is just a rough estimate, but looking at the 2010 census, possibly about 25% of the people now in the United States have never known a world without NAFTA, even though they probably don't think about it on a day-to-day basis. As many as you remember, President Trump, who was then candidate Trump, established himself as a real critic of NAFTA during the 2016 presidential campaign. He called it one of the worst deals in history and threatened to withdraw from the pact unless Canada and Mexico agreed to a better deal. So then, to the surprise of many people, Trump was elected in November 2016, creating a lot of concern and anxiety in the trade community about how he would follow through on some of his more dramatic statements about NAFTA and other trade agreements. Early in the administration, it looked like Trump might actually withdraw from NAFTA, but his aides persuaded him to seek a renegotiation instead. That formally began in August 2017, and the talks lasted for a little longer than a year. The Trump administration made a number of proposals during that negotiation that raised concerns in the trade community about the direction he was taking U.S. trade policy. One of those proposals included a sunset provision that would essentially terminate the pact after 5 years unless all the three countries agreed to continue it. Another proposal would have required 50% of the content of cars made in Canada and Mexico to come from U.S. in order to qualify for duty-free treatment under the pact. That requirement, or that proposal, was eventually dropped but it had the potential to scramble supply chains that had been built up between the three countries over the past 25 years. Eventually, the administration was able to close the agreement with Mexico, and then about a month later with Canada. Leaders of the three countries, leaders of the three countries signed the new agreement on November 30th, 2018 in Buenos Aires, where they were all attending the G20 meeting. Now it's been almost a year since the agreement has been signed, and the Trump administration still has not sent it to Congress for a vote. And the main reason for the holdup is the Democrats, who hold the majority in the House of Representatives. They've raised concerns about several provisions of the agreement that they would like to have strengthened, or in one case, weakened. In particular, the Democrats are pushing for stronger commitments in the area of labor and the environment, and they also want a stronger enforcement mechanism to make sure that Mexico, in particular, keeps its commitments in those areas. In the fourth area, they're worried that the language on intellectual property protections are too strong and may lead to higher drug prices. So for the past several months, Trump's chief trade negotiator, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, has been in talks with House Democrats to see if they can work out those differences in order for Congress to vote on the agreement before the end of this year. The House is back in session this week after a 2-week recess, and Republicans and business groups are urging Democrats to hurry up and reach a deal. However, those talks are now taking place against the backdrop of the House's newly launched impeachment proceedings, which adds a wrinkle that I've not previously encountered in the consideration of trade deals. But in a way that's typical of life under the Trump administration, where I've often found myself writing about things I never expected to happen. Anyway, with that hopefully helpful overview of where we are at the current time, let me turn first to Laura to help understand the economic significance of the agreement. Laura, could you start us off by discussing the report that the International Trade Commission did on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which they determined to only have a tiny positive impact on U.S. GDP? Could you explain what do you think are the most important features of the agreement? How does it compare to previous trade pacts? Is it, on balance, a good or bad agreement?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Doug. And thank you all for having us here today. I appreciate it. Let me just start with some little bit of background myself on U.S.-Canada and the North American trade relationship. One thing you have to keep in mind is that for decades now, pretty much everything within Canada, U.S., Mexico trade has been duty-free already, has been for some time. Probably half of it because of NAFTA, the other half of it duty-free because of the World Trade Organization, reducing tariffs to zero on a whole range of products over the course of the years, Uruguay round, Tokyo round, et cetera. And then also there's some other little dog and cat trade agreements out there, pharmaceutical agreement, that have also reduced duties to zero on U.S. Canada and U.S. Mexico trade. So when we talk about what the trade environment is today with respect to tariffs on goods, it's been zero for a very long time, and half of that is owed to NAFTA. The question then becomes that duty-free treatment within North America has resulted in, over time, the growth of a real integrated supply chain among the three countries, very integrated supply chain that has, based on studies that my company has done, supported as many as 12 million net U.S. jobs. That's job gains as well as job losses. If there were no trade with Canada and Mexico, 12 million jobs would disappear. And 630,000 of those are in manufacturing. Again, that's a net number. So we've got a lot of positive activity going on within North America as a result of the current NAFTA and the other trade agreements that we've negotiated over time. So against that backdrop, along comes the International Trade Commission, which is required by the Trade Promotion Authority law that would implement the new NAFTA. That process mandates that the International Trade Commission do this comprehensive assessment of the economic effects of the USMCA. What would it mean for US GDP? What would it mean for jobs? What would it mean for trade? And when you think about it, everything's already duty-free, and USMCA comes along and keeps things mostly duty-free. So what's the ITC study likely to show? Not a whole lot. Maybe even negative, because a lot of people were very worried that the rules of origin under USMCA for autos were significantly more restrictive than under NAFTA and could cause US companies to perhaps not use NAFTA as much as, use USMCA as much as they use NAFTA. Maybe they might decide that it was not worth the cost of uprooting their supply chain, and they would import cars from Canada and Mexico and pay the 2.5% duty because it's cheaper. In which case there would be a net negative, perhaps, effect of NAFTA, of USMCA on the US economy if the International Trade Commission pursued this research that it always does when it has to look at the effect of a trade agreement. If they did it the way they normally do it. Now, the way they normally do it is they only look at goods trade that would be affected by the proposed free trade agreement. It's really rare that they look at the other chapters of the trade agreement and try to assess the economic effects on the US economy of, say, the services chapter, or the investment chapter, or the IP chapter. And the reason for that is that the economics profession hadn't really progressed, if you will, to the degree that there was sufficient research out there that gave very conservative ITC economists and commissioners a good strong feeling that any analysis they did based on this new research on how do you model trade liberalization in services, for example, was going to withstand criticism. So they always would play it safe, and they'd only look at goods trade. They started to step outside and stick their big toe into the water with the assessment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, TPP. There they looked at goods trade, but they also added in services and investment. That was a real first. But they've never done it before that. So, okay, so now we come to the USMCA and we're wondering, well, what are they going to do? And is this going to be really bad news and really affect whether or not Congress decides to support USMCA? So they come out with their study, and lo and behold, they find that it's going to have a net positive impact on GDP of 0.35% annually, which is a lot for the ITC studies of this nature. It's twice as much as what they got for the TPP assessment. And they concluded it was going to have a one-time impact, net positive impact of 175,000 jobs. That's what they got for the TPP analysis as well, and that's more than they normally get in any sort of assessment. So we're thinking, whoa, this is really cool. What did they do? So as soon as we got our hands on a copy of this thing, we go and we look and we discover, my gosh, they've modeled everything, or nearly everything. They looked at the impact of services. They looked at agriculture, they looked at goods, but they looked at the impact of services, of intellectual property rights, of digital trade, of investment, of IPR, e-commerce. They looked at e-commerce. Some provisions in the USMCA for e-commerce are new and really great for promoting trade, and they modeled those. They don't always report the results separately, so you can't really say, well, this much is services and this much is IPR, and you can't look at the different chapters and know. But the bottom line is that they really got edgy in their analysis, and they were able to come up with what I think is actually a pretty strong assessment of what the USMCA is going to mean for the economy generally.
Okay, thanks very much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if they had used the same model on TPP, do you think they would have gotten bigger results for
Definitely.
TPP?
They would have.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, interesting. John, there was a lot of anxiety in the business community during the renegotiation about some of the proposals that the Trump administration made. But now that the agreement is concluded, the U.S. Chamber is pushing hard for approval of the pact. Can you explain why the business community thinks it should be approved? And also, do you have a sense of whether the talks between the House Democrats and USTR on revamping the pact will be successful?
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, that's a lot to chew on there. It's been a long and winding road here since the beginning of the Trump administration. As Doug points out, there were frequent threats to withdraw from NAFTA early in the administration that really caused considerable concern across the business community. As Laura points out, NAFTA has been the law of the land for a quarter century. And Doug, you said, what, a quarter of the population wasn't even alive, that
Yeah.
they don't know the pre-NAFTA world.
Right.
It's become really important to the business community to have tariff-free trade with Canada and Mexico. Those countries have become our two largest export markets. So during the negotiations, there was a lot of attention from really all kinds of industries, from automotive, which is the largest manufacturing sector in the United States, agriculture, services, you name it. And the Trump administration rolled out a series of proposals that caused considerable concern in the business community. This is an administration that looks at trade really quite differently than other recent administrations. In the post-war era, whether it's Bush or Obama or Clinton or Reagan, there's really been a lot of continuity in U.S. trade policy. But the Trump administration, during the negotiations, they wanted to scale back the investment protections in NAFTA. They wanted to roll back government procurement rules, which allow a level playing field in bidding for government contracts across the three countries. There was this sunset clause that would make it really pretty easy for the President of the United States to withdraw from the trade agreement. And a number of these caused concern, and there was quite a lot of pushback from industry and from the Congress during the negotiations. In the end, a lot of them were ratcheted back. Some of these proposals were dropped. Some of them are in there to one degree or another. But at the end of the day, what a business group like mine does is we go to our members and say, should we support this? And the vast majority of our members at the end of the day said, yeah, we should support this. And different companies, different sectors come at this in different ways. For some, it's continuity. Like for American agriculture, it's by and large, for a lot of sectors, I think Beth can elaborate on this. This is a sector, dairy, where there are notable improvements. But for a lot of them, the importance of these two markets is huge. And it's even magnified right now because of the trade war with China, where some markets have been lost. Holding on to those markets is absolutely important. So that's a sector where, for most parts of American agriculture, it's about holding on to what you've got. For others, there are real improvements, and Sam can elaborate on the digital trade piece, for instance, or intellectual property. There are forms of intellectual property that hadn't been invented yet when NAFTA was negotiated a quarter century ago. Like there's medicines called biologics, which are based on living things, didn't exist, and now they're protected under the rules of USMCA. So at the end of the day, we had a vote, and for different sectors, different reasons come to it, and very much wanted us to support this. At a time of real uncertainty for the U.S. economy when it comes to trade, because of what's going on with China and certain other threats. There's a threat to impose tariffs on automobiles from other countries. I think the business community wants to have the certainty that we're going to have that guaranteed access to our two most important export markets. They're not just one and two, as our friends at the National Association of Manufacturers point out. They buy more U.S.-made manufactured goods than the next 12 countries on the list combined. So really important for sector after sector. Briefly on the other part of your question about what's going on with the state of play on So beginning in about June, the Trump administration began a process of trying to get House Democrats, who of course are now in the majority, on board with this trade agreement. And I think most Democrats will candidly admit that, yeah, there's progress in this trade agreement compared to NAFTA. There are stronger labor and environmental rules. Under NAFTA, those issues were addressed in side agreements. They weren't enforceable. But even though many Democrats would acknowledge this progress, they still have a number of lingering concerns relating to enforcement, labor, the environment, and drug prices. And so Speaker Pelosi put together a working group of House Democrats, 9 House Democrats led by Chairman Richard Neal of the House Ways and Means Committee, who have been having regular meetings with U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer. by many accounts and public statements from both sides, they've made progress. They feel like they're getting close. Some concerns have been addressed. I have heard from administration officials they feel like you could get in a room and lock the door for 2 or 3 hours and work your way through a series of what are mostly political decisions at this point. It's not really technical at what's going on. And then take 24, 48 hours to draw up the legal text, and you would have a deal here. So they've made progress. There's optimism that a deal can be reached. And I think under those circumstances, what we're finding, because we at the Chamber and many others across agriculture and business have had a boatload of meetings on Capitol Hill. Members of Congress have heard from the private sector again and again. The votes are there for this. The votes are definitely there for this. We're feeling pretty confident about this. But we need to have that deal struck, that handshake, where Speaker Pelosi and the Trump administration come together and say, okay, we're going to move forward on this. And it's a difficult environment, to put it delicately, with impeachment and everything else that's going on. But I do think there are real incentives for Democrats to make this deal as well. There's several dozen House Democrats who are elected from, they call them frontliners sometimes. This means you're maybe a Democrat, but you were elected from a district that voted for Donald Trump in 2016. They don't want to go back for re-election having done nothing but impeach the president. They want to be able to show that they've been practical and worked on issues that are of importance to the economy. And moving forward on USMCA is something that would do that. So.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time on Capitol Hill to see how this is going to unfold and if they'll get to that handshake or not. Alex, I'd like to turn to you next. Some of the biggest changes in the negotiations were made to the automotive rules of origin, which determine the amount of parts from Canada, Mexico, and the United States that have to go into the car in order for it to receive duty-free treatment under the pact. Otherwise, as Laura said, it faces a 2.5% tariff for passenger cars, 25% for pickup trucks. So could you talk about those changes and describe what impact you think they'll have on the auto sector?
Sure. And again, thanks everyone for coming today, and thanks for having me. So the NAFTA rule of origin actually is already the highest in the world that we're aware of. 62.5% of a vehicle has to come from Mexico, Canada, or the United States, or as Doug pointed out, it doesn't move duty-free. Similarly, with engines, transmissions, other major parts, it's 62.5 as well. So the USMCA is a whole other universe. There are actually 4 different elements of the USMCA rule of origin. If you don't meet one of them for a vehicle, you're paying those tariffs. And as Doug pointed out, it's 2.5% on a car, 25% on a truck coming to the United States. In Mexico, it's 20% for cars and trucks if you're exporting there. For Canada, it's 6.1. So those are big numbers, and possibly they make that market inaccessible or definitely reduce your competitiveness vis-a-vis vehicles that are built in that market or shipped in from another market with a free trade agreement. So the 4 elements are: 1, the vehicle has to meet a rule of origin content requirement of 75%. So this is a significant uptick. 2, core parts like engines, transmissions, electric vehicle batteries are going to have to meet a 75% rule of origin. 3, producers are going to have to show that for their North American production, 70% of their steel and 70% of their aluminum was bought in North America. And 4th, you have to meet a labor value content requirement where you demonstrate that 40% of your car or 45% of your truck was made with labor, whether it's the vehicle, the final assembly, or the parts, because you're going to need both, with labor that was paid at least $16 an hour. So all 4 of those criteria need to be hit, or you're going to be paying tariffs. This is going to be a game changer in terms of what it does domestically. I think that for us personally, FCA, we're thinking about sourcing in a way we never did before. Historically, we've been a North American company, so meeting the 62.5% rule of origin was not especially challenging. Our customs team and our purchasing teams worked together, but it wasn't as if purchasing was really thinking about this. And we will have to think about that. We will have to think about where we source and how we source. in a way we haven't done previously. With that said, for us, we don't think it's going to affect our competitiveness, whether it's in North America or globally. I can't speak for my competitors. However, given that our footprint, our historic footprint, is a lot deeper than some of them, I imagine that they may be facing more challenges than we are.
Okay, interesting. Thanks, Alex. Sam, one area the ITC reported or highlighted as a real plus was the digital trade chapter. I think a lot of people may not be aware of the barriers that companies face in the digital trade space. Could you talk about them, how the USMCA addresses them, and do companies currently face significant trade barriers in Canada and Mexico, or are these provisions more important as a precedent for future trade deals?
Sure. Thanks, Doug, and thanks everybody for having me here. I think maybe a couple of points right off the bat, and then I would like to spend some time sort of talking about what are digital trade provisions and what do they do and why do they matter. The first is I'm sort of here in my capacity as a representative of the tech industry, and our membership, ITI's membership, represents a pretty broad cross-section, and I think something important to note there is that tech is not just your internet companies. It's not solely Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, although those are members. It's also hardware, it's software, it's cloud services, it's cybersecurity. And so we count in our membership Honeywell, for instance, or Toyota as a tech-enabled company that relies quite a bit on the transfer of data. A second point, since Doug, you rightly pointed out at the outset, so NAFTA is a 26-year-old agreement. It mentions the telegraph, but it doesn't mention the internet. And so when we're talking about how trade is conducted in the modern era, we're always talking, of course, about goods and services trade, sort of the more traditional means that trade has taken place for years. Increasingly, we're talking about data transfers, both as a means of day-to-day operations, also as a means and a vehicle for the transfer of content across borders and digital goods. And so without going into a litany of statistics, there are a few illustrative ones that are applicable in the North American context, but are also globally applicable. So one, from 2005 to 2015, the number of, or the quantity of cross-border data flows increased by 45 times. So if you look at that versus any metric of an increase in goods and services trade, that's notable. That increase in data transfers coincided with an increase of global GDP, and in fact caused an increase of global GDP of over 10%. And so you're seeing digital trade as sort of a driver of trade generally speaking. And something that's reflective of that is, again, we're not simply talking about companies that only exist online. We're talking about all industries. And so a lot of, in fact, 75% of the value that are created by cross-border data flows accrue to traditional industries, not the kinds of industries that you would think of as solely existing online, but manufacturing and the like. And so you can imagine in the trade realm, and as governments have looked at, well, how do you regulate the emergence of these new technologies? How do you regulate trade that's taking place largely in the digital sphere or increasingly in the digital sphere? And one byproduct of that, or a direct result, has been the emergence of regulatory approaches that are discriminatory in nature. So what are we talking about in terms of barriers to digital trade? One principal one that you hear time and time again, and that our companies face in markets all over the world, and I'll come to North America because that's a good question, and that's what we're here to talk about, but is the localization of data centers. So a mandatory requirement that you locate your data servers, to put it simply, in a country as a means of doing business in that country. And so you can imagine that for some companies that's undesirable, for some it's prohibitive. You simply can't do that while still operating in a particular country. Another byproduct of that is that by forcing a company to locate the servers where it might not make technical sense to do that, you may be somehow denigrating the quality of the product or service that's ultimately delivered, and that varies company by company. Another sort of shining provision, and we'll look at what's actually in the agreement a little bit, is a prohibition on internet tariffs or customs duties on electronic transmissions. This has been one of the shining successes of the WTOs to date. Every 2 years, at least up until now, ministers have come together since 1998 to agree in sort of a handshake, informal, but to this point adhered to agreement, that countries will not impose tariffs on electronic transmissions. Now, if you think about the quantities that we're discussing in the electronic transmissions, whether they be software or digital products like music or movies or streaming, all that goes across borders every day, the idea that you would impose tariffs on those is mind-boggling in some senses, but also, I think, deeply impacting from a business perspective as well. And so one of the commitments in USMCA that has been replicated elsewhere and has existed for a long time is a permanent ban on customs duties on electronic transmissions. Some of the other trade barriers that you see, this is discussed quite a bit in the China context as well, is that if you as a company want to do business in a country either through measures on the books or de facto measures, you've got to forfeit some of your source code or algorithms, some of those sort of the guts of your technical processes that provide value for your services. And so that has a trade impact. It's not something that's been neatly disciplined through other trade provisions to date, and that's something that's seen as deeply successful. There are also provisions on privacy, requirements that there be sort of interoperable approaches to privacy that are taken while maintaining a baseline of privacy protections for consumers. The same with approaches to cybersecurity. And that sort of gets into this broader discussion of how do you regulate emerging technologies in a way that doesn't discriminate against companies from other territories, but also provides assurances that governments have the leeway to do what they need to do in order to offer those protections. So I guess turning to your last question, and then I'll stop there. Within the North American market, some of these more pernicious barriers, these sort of mandatory data localization measures or the imposition of customs duties on electronic transmissions, that's not something that we've seen a lot in the North American market. So while I think these provisions are certainly important with respect to Canada and Mexico and that they're largely forward-looking, so you're trying to sort of predict what are going to be the trade barriers du jour and try and write the rules of the road so it's coming in sort of a preemptive time. A lot of the value in the USMCA chapter is in setting a model that's applicable worldwide. So in containing these sorts of commitments about what you shouldn't do in the digital space to discriminate against foreign companies, that's setting a model for negotiations that are taking place in Geneva at the WTO, a model for the recent digital trade agreement between the US and Japan, and a model for other governments that are like-minded around the world. So I think, that's not to say that because it didn't address sort of huge existing trade barriers, that there aren't items of concern that are sort of nascent and emerging. And digital services tax is one that's been in the news quite a bit lately. That's something that's come up in the context of Prime Minister Trudeau's re-election campaign, this idea that you would impose 3% tax on digitally provided services and in such a way that it appears to kind of disproportionately target US companies. And I think it's highly possible as well that as new approaches are taken to privacy, to cybersecurity, to artificial intelligence, I think having these rules sort of govern how that can be undertaken in a way that's not discriminatory is important in the North American market.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, Laura might correct me if I'm wrong, but when I looked at the ITC report recently, it seemed to be saying that the policy certainty provided by the digital trade provision, that's why they found a positive economic impact. If it wasn't for that policy certainty, it would be negative.
Right.
So that was kind of an aspect of the digital trade chapter that I wasn't aware of at first when the ITC report came out, but then when I reviewed it again recently, I noticed that. Beth, for about as long as I've been covering trade, which is far too long, I've heard the dairy industry complain about the lack of market access in Canada. And when President Trump announced that we were going to renegotiate NAFTA, the dairy industry was like, "Oh yeah, we're on board. This is like long overdue." So could you talk about why dairy farmers have been so frustrated by Canada's supply management system, how the USMCA addresses that, and what sort of dairy products will benefit from these openings?
Sure. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Doug, for moderating. So I work for the International Dairy Foods Association, and we represent dairy processors. and marketers of dairy products. So all the wonderful things that you enjoy, fluid milk, cheese, yogurt, ice cream, and our members also make things like infant formula and other dairy-derived ingredients. So we represent about 90% of all the milk that is produced and marketed in the United States. And so when we saw this opportunity to renegotiate NAFTA, we went full speed ahead. As John mentioned, the uncertainty that came with a NAFTA renegotiation wasn't something that the agriculture industry jumped up for joy about, and neither did we in dairy. The whole agricultural community came together really early on. I think we were one of the first sectors to come out and say, okay, we definitely want to modernize this agreement for a lot of reasons that were already discussed up here. But first and foremost, we want to do no harm because the North American market, Canada and Mexico, top markets for agriculture. The supply chains are so integrated that we really didn't want anything to disrupt that. But in the dairy industry, we did see an opportunity. 26 years ago when NAFTA was implemented, Canada rather was able to keep dairy off the table. Because they run a supply management system, which has 3 pillars: they control imports, they control prices, and they control production. They were able to keep out that dairy piece in NAFTA. And the United States did the same thing with other products as well. This is not the first time this has happened. But we saw this as an opportunity to gain more market access into the Canadian market, given that it is our northern border, and the Canadian consumer would also like to enjoy some of the products that we make that they don't make in Canada. So we went, tried to negotiate amongst ourselves in the dairy industry what were the important products that we really wanted to go after, knowing that Canada, because of their supply management system, was not going to open up, fully like the Mexican market. So there are certain products that we already send up to Canada. A lot of cheese for pizza cheese, mozzarella. There's some other products as well that we send up there. So we kind of looked at that broad swath of products, and then we saw some other opportunities where, we make a lot more yogurts in this country now. Greek yogurt, for instance, is obviously a very popular product. A lot of ice cream, things that we weren't seeing the opportunity for in Canada. And we were able to get some minimal access at the end of the day. And so we're hopeful that, we are able to fill those quotas, that Canada doesn't put up more restrictions and barriers, because that's something that they do. We've seen them not fulfill some of their obligations in their agreement with the Europeans, and then also under the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we'll be really vigilant in making sure that they fulfill some of basically the spirit of the agreement. For agriculture, though, in general, I think that some of the pieces that we were excited about that modernize this agreement were the sanitary and phytosanitary chapter, the SPS chapter, those measures. And then for us, especially in dairy, in the intellectual property chapter, there were some provisions to protect common cheese names and common food names. And we can get into that more if you want. But really, it's just another way to make sure that my members, the dairy companies that are exporting product to Canada and Mexico, don't have some of these non-tariff barriers in place. So for overall, we definitely see USMCA as a net plus for us. Even the ITC report saw it as a net plus for the dairy industry. I think about $277 million gain for us. So we'll take it and we'll run with it, and we're really excited about it and hopeful that it will pass by the end of the year, and we can gain some of that certainty back, where, as John mentioned, we have some other issues happening in China and other markets.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that the concern that Canada might find some other way to frustrate this imports. So are you sort of, do you share the Democrats' concerns that the enforcement mechanisms of NAFTA or USMCA maybe aren't as strong as they need to be? And do you think that, are you hopeful that they'll be stronger as a result of these talks that are going on?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that is one of the wonderful things about a trade agreement is the ability to actually enforce it, right? The dispute settlement mechanism is important. So, yes, we've been telling House Democrats and Republicans alike, you know, they all understand the need to have an enforceable trade agreement. And for us to be able to have a gain for dairy into the Canadian market, we need to make sure that it's enforceable at the end of the day. There are some other provisions as well as just the quotas and the access that we got. Some of the other technical pieces that we want to make sure are enforceable so that Canada doesn't try and bypass the spirit of the agreement.
Laura, I'm going to kind of throw you a curveball because I forgot that we were asked to talk about the consumer impact. Can you wing that a little bit? I mean, do you think do you think that consumers are going to see much of an impact one way or another as a result of this agreement?
Yeah, not a lot.
Is that because the tariffs are already low, and so there's not going to be much pass?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not going to be huge. The International Trade Commission estimated that wages would go up by about 0.5%, or $150 per worker per year, so that's more spending power there.
Okay.
So not a lot, but it's positive.
Okay. Okay. And I mean, and generally, I guess having duty-free trade will help keep prices low.
Yeah, and
And-
certainly the opposite, no NAFTA, no USMCA.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, we're getting close to 10 till 7. I know that we didn't start exactly at 6, but I'd like to give, like, are there any questions out there rather than just like, if not, I have more, but if there's questions from the audience, we would take those now. You could go up to the microphones on the side. Okay, why don't you go ahead, sir?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm faculty here at the Smith School. And, I'm proud to be a citizen of at least 2 of the countries that are represented in the USMCA. One of the big concerns of the current administration has been extraterritoriality with trade agreements, not just the USMCA, but the other trade agreements, and how the trade agreements infringe on sort of domestic sort of regulatory authority or domestic laws. And I know that during the discussions over the USMCA, there was some talk about the extraterritorial aspects of NAFTA and eliminating those. I was just wondering whatever would happen finally. Are corporations still allowed to sue governments, or what has changed, if anything, with the USMCA?
Oh. Well, are you asking about the investor-state dispute settlement process? I might turn to John on that. It was, I think that there was a proposal to maybe get rid of it entirely. My memory could be wrong on that, but in the end, it was kept, but scaled back in both the case of Canada and Mexico. Is that right, John?
No, that's right. You know, so investment protection provisions appear in more than 40 U.S. bilateral investment treaties and trade agreements we have with nearly 20 countries. And what they do is guarantee that investors will receive what's called national treatment, that they won't be treated worse than domestic companies are, and certain other protections. They'll be immune to expropriation. But the way it's enforced is a mechanism called investor-state dispute settlement, where arbitral panels are created to uphold those. So NAFTA had that. USMCA, it's quite different. It was eliminated entirely with Canada. It remains in the case of Mexico, but for limited sectors. So, for instance, the oil and gas sector, I think the rationale there is that, I think Bob Lighthizer, the USTR, the reason that he gave for wanting to get rid of it is that he regarded it to some degree as a provision that creates a positive incentive for the offshoring of jobs. Basically, you're making it more attractive to invest in, say, Mexico, because you have a higher assurance that your investment will be safe. And why would the U.S. government want to do that? The business community doesn't agree with that, but to cut to the short of it, he was willing to allow this provision to continue to exist in the case of the oil and gas sector, for instance, because companies go and produce oil or gas in Mexico, not because they're offshoring jobs, but because that's where the oil and gas is, right? So and the bottom line is it's much more limited in this case than in previous trade agreements.
Anybody else? Young man, did you have a question?
Why did you come here? That way
Okay.
everybody online would
Hi, my name is Nazat Dal. I'm a third-year MBA MPP student here at the university. Thank you all for coming to talk with us and share your insights. I actually had two sort of unrelated questions. The first one I think is maybe more targeted to Alexander. I know one of the proposed provisions was sort of looking at the wage match with the U.S. Salaries for some Mexican production. How do you, I guess, what are your thoughts on sort of that as a more long-term impact, sort of reducing the comparative advantage of shifting production to Mexico in the first place?
So the labor value content requirement, which is one of the 4 elements of the rule of origin I alluded to, does include that $16 an hour wage requirement. So what we see that doing is 2 things. Well, one, if I build a vehicle and I've got components that are in the U.S., Canada, Mexico, ostensibly I'm going to have to go to each of my suppliers to confirm that a certain percentage of those components, based on their value, get me to that 40% or 45% threshold, depending on whether it's a car or a truck. So if they don't, I'm going to have to figure out, how do I make up that deficit? Do I move production of that part in Mexico up to the U.S.? Do I look to see whether or not I can get more components, subcomponents for that part that's assembled in Mexico and send them down there? I mean, those are really your options. And so I think it's going to do the main thing I think it's going to do is actually increase wages in the United States to the extent that folks aren't already making $16 an hour. In most union shops, and all of our assembly plants are represented by the UAW, that's not an issue. But in facilities where that's not the case, I think there's going to be situations where they're going to have to elevate their wages.
Great. And the second one was sort of more broadly for the panel. As we see the tariff, quote-unquote, war continue to escalate or continue to persist, what do you make of more permanent supply chain shifts that might be happening, not just temporary shifts during the duration, but more permanent shifts that might impact U.S. labor in the long run?
For trade, the tariff war generally, broadly, or
Sure.
Yeah. Well, we're already starting to see a lot of shifting out of China, but not back to the United States, to other Asian countries for the most part, and India, South Asia, places like that. That's the bulk of what's happening. There is some stuff coming back to the United States, but not anywhere near as much as the president would hope. So yeah, the trade war is shifting supply chains. It's going to take a long time for that to really happen to a big extent.
Right.
So in the meantime, we're paying higher costs because of the tariffs, production that can't move. It's going to be an extended process, and the uncertainty even of it is just, even if the tariffs were eliminated tomorrow, the uncertainty that is going to hang over buyers in this country, sourcing people in this country because the tariffs could come back, that is going to continue to drive movement on the supply chain.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions out there?
Well, maybe I'll
yeah.
ask one. So I was encouraged when John said that we might be hours away from a deal, or that people that people who want to not let Trump get a win, those are not the ones quote unquote win, I should say.
Yeah.
Those aren't the ones that'll prevail. But my question was, can any of you speak to Mexico and Canada, and Canada particularly, the politics surrounding the deal over there, and also to what the economic impacts we've heard about the United States, but the economic impacts in Mexico and Canada of the USMCA, what they would be.
Well, in terms of Canada, I mean, obviously they're having an election right now, and I think it's next week.
Next
that they-
Monday.
21st.
Next Monday that they go to the polls, and so the whole approval process has been on hold pending the outcome of that election, and also I think pending the outcome of what's going to happen in the talks between the administration and Congress. They kind of want to wait to see whether the U.S. is going to approve it. But I don't think it's actually, and if others know better, I don't think it's actually been much of an election issue. I mean, I don't, if the conservatives were to win, I think that it probably would still be approved, assuming it's approved here in the United States. In terms of the economic impact on Canada and Mexico, does anybody have a?
I think both Canada and Mexico, trade is a larger share of their economy than it is in the U.S. You know, in the U.S., you add exports and imports together, it's about 30% of our economy. It's quite a lot. I think it's closer to 45% in Canada, and I think more in Mexico. So, in some ways, trade winds up being a little bit less controversial in Canada historically because they know they're a trading nation, and that's why it's the Liberals. Right now, the election polling in Canada shows a pretty close race between the Liberals and the Conservatives. The Liberals negotiated this agreement. It's their agreement. They're all going to vote for it. The Conservatives are historically the party of free trade in Canada. They negotiated the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement back in 1988. They ran an election on this. It's in their DNA. So there's not a lot of, I think, real tension going on there. And in Mexico, the new government there, which has a very large majority in Congress, is very committed to this. I think the Mexicans know that they need this agreement. They're extremely dependent on the U.S. market. So they're very much paying attention to what happens here, and there's a certain amount of anxiety, I think.
And they've already approved it.
Mhm.
Mexico did, that's right,
Right.
quite easily and quickly. So.
I have one last question
Okay.
coming from me.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I think it's very well-rounded panel to discuss all these topics. Some critics of the USMCA say that the agreement is somewhat or is more U.S.-centric, and kind of building up on the last question. How do you see this kind of playing out in the long term between the relationship between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S.?
Well, I mean, the U.S. is sort of the economic heavyweight of North America, and so I think it's maybe not surprising that it was able to get terms more favorable for itself than for the other trading partners. It's kind of, I mean, the Trump administration definitely has a different approach to trade policy than other administrations. I mean, every administration tries to maximize the benefit for their own industries, but there's also this idea of in trade negotiations of like enlarging the pie, and if you enlarge the pie, then everybody gets a bigger piece. And I don't know if the Trump administration thinks about the negotiations that way. I mean, they seem to think of it as the pie is fixed, and I want to get the biggest piece of it. That's my impression. And I think that again, other people can speak, but I think for Canada and Mexico, they want the continuity. They want the stability of the relationship. They don't want trade ties disrupted. They don't want to go through the nightmare of Trump withdrawing from NAFTA, and so they're all just crossing their fingers and hoping that this gets done, and that we can go back to normal.
I might just jump in because I think, there are a lot of provisions in USMCA that are, maybe of kind of the less sexy variety, and so they're not making it to the front pages, and they're less tied to market access, and they're less tied to rules of origin. But at the same time, they do sort of represent a gold standard for what's been included in trade agreements to date. And so, I've talked about the digital trade chapter as something that is hugely important to us, but also really important in terms of the precedent that it sets for engagement in other initiatives. The same could be true, and it sort of gets more technical on down the line, but technical barriers to trade. How do you craft regulatory measures that aren't discriminatory? How do you rely on international standards? How do you prevent, and again, this gets wonky quickly, but how do you prevent discrimination from testing bodies? A lot of the provisions that have been negotiated represent an evolution that's occurred through TPP, through TTIP, through other agreements. And what you're seeing is sort of the state of the art with respect to how you try and address some of these very specific technical barriers to trade. The same is true with respect to good regulatory practices. How do you have transparent approaches with notice and comment, with redress in terms of how governments develop regulation? And so these tend to be kind of the less hard, less front and center commitments, but in terms of good governance, which I agree is probably was not the political imperative for the renegotiation of NAFTA, but it's still really important with respect to, I think, not just U.S. trade policy, but Canadian and Mexican trade policy in other contexts.
And just adding on there, as a company that's trying to access markets around the world, don't underestimate how difficult those regulatory issues can be and what an impediment they can be to get into a new market, even for a large company like ourselves. So if you're a startup or a small business trying to export to a new market, and you're dealing with opaque, non-transparent regulatory bodies or requiring testing certificates, that can be a deal breaker for you. So to the extent these are the gold standard, that's a big deal and something that we should be very aware of. It's a good point.
Has the enforcement changed in any way, the rules of enforcement changed in any way to account for some of these new things, like biologics and digital trade or any of those, or new kinds of regulations, or is that not required with the old enforcement mechanism up to the task?
That's actually one of the hot issues of the day that's under discussion between Democrats and Republicans. And this is an area where I think many people in the business community agree with what the Democrats are looking for here. There's a problem with the way the enforcement mechanism in NAFTA worked, and it was replicated in USMCA. So Speaker Pelosi, she talks about enforcement more than she does any of the other issues. The flaw, by the way, has to do with you enforce trade agreements by forming a panel that will look at the complaint that's brought against a party. But under the NAFTA and now under the USMCA, the party against whom the complaint is brought can block the formation of a panel, so it can't get its work done. More recent U.S. trade agreements have fixed this problem. And I think this will be fixed. It's something that Democrats are pushing for. And at the end of the day, I think everybody's going to have a good story to tell. I think somebody said something about giving Donald Trump a win. That's not what it's going to be at the end of the day. Democrats will be able to say, well, we got some fixes here that were not just minor things. There were big changes, and we got it done. And everybody's going to have a positive story to tell.
I know that we want to wrap this up, but John, do you think that they can do all that without having to go back to Canada and Mexico and ask them for changes to the agreement?
Well, they will in some fashion. But for instance, the issue I just mentioned, in the TPP, which Canada and Mexico have already implemented, they fixed it.
Okay.
So that particular one's not a heavy lift. But there will, assuming that there is a deal struck here, there is going to be a choreographed process where they have to go to our trading partners and get their sign-off. I think the administration has confidence in that, but it'll be interesting to watch.
Right. It will be interesting to watch, particularly to see if they can all pull this off by the end of the year. I guess the paranoia about that is that if it slips into the election year, it'll never get done. But I don't know if I entirely believe that. But Oh, I'm sorry.
So this actually just came through my Twitter feed from Politico, but Nancy Pelosi actually just called off, or I guess put a standstill on the impeachment vote in the proceedings.
Oh.
Do you think this will kind of switch the focus back towards the trade agreement and with the election and everything coming up?
Well, I'd like to read that story and see, and see why she did it. I mean, the impeachment is obviously a big distraction, and it has the potential to further antagonize the relations between the Democrats and the White House. I mean, the White House is already out there blaming impeachment, blaming the fact that nothing's happening on USMCA on impeachment, which is sort of a mischaracterization because things are happening on USMCA, and look like they will continue even with the impeachment. So, but if they're stopping the impeachment inquiry, I guess that's positive for USMCA. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I'd like to read the story.
Huh. Okay. Well, that's fascinating.
Thanks for the Twitter or
Thanks for the late
the
breaking
ticker
news.
tape.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I actually want to thank the panel for coming out to College Park to speak with us this evening on this very important topic, and to you all for your questions. If you would join me in giving our panel a round of applause. And on your way out, as promised, there is pizza, so please grab some on your way out. Thank you very much.